And we're live. Uh, Hello and welcome. My name is Sean Johnson Andrews. I am the immediate past president of the Cultural Studies Association, and I'm your host here at Breaking Culture Live. I'm broadcasting from the north side of Chicago.
And I'm Rob Carley. I'm your co-host, and I'm coming to you from Central Texas.
Thank you for joining us for our fourth episode of Breaking Culture Live. This program is an experiment in scholarly communication. Every Wednesday around lunchtime in Chicago or New York or brunch time on the west coast of the US, we'll spend half an hour breaking down the breaking news with cultural studies scholars and activists, discussing their work and how it helps us to understand a contemporary event or emerging trend and intervene in making the world a better place. Today, we're grateful to be joined by three scholars who are doing work on the emergence of what a special forum in the latest issue of the journal Communication and Critical Cultural Studies calls Authoritarian Sexual Politics. This forum was conceived 1 year ago today on the eve of the Trump regime's sweep of the US political landscape. So we'll be speaking with these scholars about what each of them saw in that moment in terms of the cultural and affective dimensions of authoritarianism and the sexual politics that sustain it, and also just how the last year has affirmed or challenged their observations. Megan Wood is a cultural studies scholar and assistant professor of communication and media at Ohio Northern University, who researches and writes about the relays between popular culture and U.S. politics. Wood is a Cultural Studies Association governing board member and an author and editor of numerous publications. She edited the forum, and her introduction, Daddy's Home, Sexual Politics, Authoritarian Desire, and the Re-election of Donald Trump, illuminates some of the dark and creepy resonances in Trump's victory. So thanks for joining us, Megan.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here chatting with you all.
Erin J. Reed is Associate Professor in Communication and Rhetorical Studies and affiliated with LGBTQ Studies and Women's and Gender Studies at Syracuse University. Her scholarship examines rhetorics of gender and sexuality in public discourse, focusing particularly on queer and feminist modes of agency, dissent, and social protest. She's currently working on a project entitled Weaponizing Trans Youth, Anti-Trans Legislation and Rhetorics of Care, which investigates how, over the past decade, trans youth's gender identities, bodies, and private medical decisions have become normalized as a site of public investigation and controversy. Her piece in this collection reflects upon some of this work, which unfortunately has become ever more relevant with the anti-trans rhetoric, legislation, and Supreme Court judgments over the last year. Thanks for joining us, Erin.
Thanks for having me.
And finally, we're joined by Isra Ali, who is a clinical associate professor in the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication at the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development at New York University. Her research focuses on the intersections of feminism, militarism, and citizenship in culture and media. Dr. Ali is completing a book, Feminist Militarism, the Forever War, Women War Zone Correspondence in Afghanistan, 2001 to 2021, that considers the influence of what her piece in this collection calls feminist militarism in contemporary U.S. politics through the work of women war zone correspondents who traveled to Afghanistan from North America and Western Europe from 2001 on to report on the oppression of Afghan women and their liberation via military intervention. Thanks for joining us, Isra.
Thank you so much for having me, Sean.
I'm talking to you here from Chicago, where this past weekend we had dueling notions of safety and security. On the one hand, we had the governor of Illinois begging the Department of Homeland Security to refrain from conducting raids over the Halloween weekend, saying, quote, no child should be forced to inhale tear gas or other chemical agents while trick-or-treating in their own neighborhoods. Much as you discuss in your piece, Isra, we've seen a lot of this kind of what you call hard power directed against residents of the city over the past few months. But the response of Kristi Noem, Secretary of Homeland Security, was that, quote, we're absolutely not willing to put on pause any work that we will do to keep communities safe, end quote. She then went on to say that she was actually protecting Chicago's children by, quote, getting criminals off the street so they can't victimize them. So running through your essays, all three of you, there's this paternalistic conception of care that I think Erin's piece encapsulates really well, where she says paternalistic care upholds authority by imagining the targets of care to be unable to care for themselves and presenting acts of correction and control as demonstrations of love. I don't know if this is exactly what you all mean by authoritarian sexual politics, but it feels like this concept is not directly speaking about gender as an identity or a category of subjectivity, and more about gender and sexuality as modes and metaphors of politics. So while I hope we can have each of you sort of speak to how this concept is reflected in your work, I'll first ask Megan, who convened this forum, about her original conception of this idea and how you saw it reflected in the second Trump regime's ascendance, and maybe where you see things now.
Yes, certainly. Thanks, Sean. When I proposed this forum, as you said, literally on the eve of the 2024 election, I was sitting in front of my TV watching election night, and I drafted an email to Marina Levina, who's the editor of the Journal, and was like, we need to have a forum on this. I was trying to, I think, name something that I think a lot of us were already clocking, which was how fundamental various concerns around sex and gender and sexuality had become to the campaign promises and pieces of propaganda and the sort of stated policy priorities of the Trump administration, or the sort of second iteration of the Trump administration, and how that was working pretty effectively as a strategy of authoritarian consolidation through his campaign. And the term authoritarian sexual politics for me is really about a kind of like affective and ideological fusion of the intimate and the political. So we see it in the ways that gender anxieties are mobilized, like in the many appeals that this second Trump campaign made to young men as socially and economically downtrodden, especially on podcasts during this past election cycle, but also in how particular gendered identities are weaponized, which is what Erin writes about with respect to the extraordinary panic over trans kids. And then also to how certain fears and insecurities get mapped onto hierarchical, or probably more specifically patriarchal, sexual imaginaries. And you see that in the various discourses of protection, which were absolutely laced through Trump's inauguration speech. And when J.D. Vance delivered that turning point speech that I opened the essay with just before the election, where his extended metaphor of Trump as daddy coming to spank his disobedient child who had been a bad girl, it was obvious that he was having fun and trying to, get this audience going. But I was really darkly fascinated by the audience's response to that, and how his whole base sort of, I guess you would say, post-ironically embraced it. We've probably memory hold it by now, but at the time, Roseanne Barr and this rapper named Tom McDonald even released a single and a music video that had hundreds of thousands of views for a Trump anthem they titled Daddy's Home, which was celebrating his reelection. And you could buy t-shirts on the streets that depicted Trump as Daddy Don. And to me, this whole sort of scene was kind of a crystallization of the effectiveness of authoritarian sexual politics. And so I was looking back at the time at a lot of feminist anti-fascist work that was produced in the 30s and also in the 1970s, that understood fascism as a deeply racialized, but also explicitly sexual formation. And I think that work helps us to recognize some of the continuities in how authoritarian formations work by manipulating instability and reproducing and stabilizing what I talk about in the essay as certain structures of desire. And I follow political theorist Albert Toscano, who writes on fascism, in describing this as what he calls a scalar formation, which is one that moves between the intimate and the national and the global. Essentially the same logics of sex gender disorder that naturalize patriarchal authority in the household is what also justifies militarized border control and campaigns of deportation as protection of the family, and also foments desire for the erasure of queer and trans folk, not just in the US, but globally. And these are both, features of authoritarian sexual politics that Isra and Erin also take up in the forum. So for me, proposing this forum was, I'm very grateful to these people for answering the call, but I wanted to bring scholars together to really think beyond the election itself and across these scales so that we could sort of see sexual politics as something more than just a reflection of authoritarianism, but whose mechanisms are inherent to how it works. So I was very glad to have these different voices speaking to these different dimensions of authoritarian sexual politics.
Yeah, that opening line where just all of the stuff about you need a spanking. It's gonna hurt you more than me. Like that. Even those that but that's an expression of love. These it's hard to kind of get into the mindset of someone who would find that attractive or desirable, but that it's clearly something that really took off.
Yeah. I mean, historically, authoritarian movements and leaders, and I talk about this in the essay, have done a lot of work to shore up popular investments of desire in, the traditional, by which I mean the cis heterosexual reproductive family ideal. Part of what I was interested in highlighting in the essay is that the Trump coalition has been very successful in leveraging like profound senses of loss that are connected to the long-term erosion of what is effectively a cultural and social and economic settlement built around the cultivation of this like fantasy of the nuclear family as like the core of American life. And I mean, this is what Make America Great Again is all about, right? Insisting on the innocence and the desirability of this fantasy as the foundation of American well-being. But what the Trump coalition does is they recognize that it's fallen apart, and they exploit the psychoaffective dimensions of that in a number of ways, right? So how do we identify various threats like to masculinity, or flavor the characterization of enemies like immigrants stealing blue-collar jobs, or the queer feminists and trans individuals who are attacking the very essence of womanhood? So that sort of image of patriarchal authority being restored, I think, is really central to how the Trump coalition really mobilizes authoritarian sexual politics.
Well, I don't know if others have a statement about authoritarian sexual politics, but one of the other pieces that you're kind of already hinting at, Erin, in your piece, you argue convincingly that gender affirming care and trans kids have been used as what you call an effective weapon by the GOP in recent years, particularly in the run up to the 2024 election, which is sort of the main context for your piece. But you also conclude by saying that, quote, it was never about trans kids. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about this concept of an effective weapon and the moral panic about trans kids, and how that's used as a way of kind of advancing what you call de-democratizing and nationalist forces worldwide, which seems to be a dimension of this authoritarian sexual politics.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. So I guess I'll start by saying I started working on this piece kind of in the aftermath of finishing a book project. The book is called Minor Troubles, and it looks at a series of controversies over young people, gender, and sexuality in public discourse. And that book is focused mostly on roughly the early 2000s and 2010s-ish. And one of the cases that I was looking at in the book is the case of Gavin Grimm, who was a trans boy in Virginia who sued his school board for the right to use the boys' bathroom at school. And so his case starts off in 2014, and that was in the midst of the first wave of all the anti-trans bathroom bills, most of which in that first wave were fairly unsuccessful. And so I wrote about his case in my book. And as I was finishing the book in 2024 during this election cycle, I was really struck by how the anti-trans discourse a decade earlier seemed very different to me. So the way that Republicans were mobilizing anti-trans discourse in 2024 seemed to really take a different kind of perspective on, what trans kids were to them, what kind of object they were, and then how they were deploying that object, as it turns out, very persuasively, right? And so what I'm trying to work through in this essay is how trans kids are not being taken as subjects. They're not being understood as, an actual group of humans for whom we need to develop the most effective or humane policies. Instead, they are an object in an argument, right? So I'm proposing that trans kids functioned for conservatives as what I call an affective weapon by drawing on. So I'm working with Sarah Ahmed's notion of happy objects, where people sort of feel themselves to be part of something based on their shared feelings toward a particular object. And so trans kids obviously don't work as a happy object for conservatives, but they do work as a kind of unhappy object, right? Where people have this shared bad feelings toward an object. And then I'm also working with what Joe Shu has called affective drift, which is the ability for kind of discontentment about one thing to drift on to something else. And so I think this is a really effective way to understand what's going on with trans kids, because conservatives have been able to take people's discomfort with a whole range of issues, everything from, having to think about structural racism to thinking about the kind of new representations, new media presence of trans people, queer people, thinking about feminism, thinking about, new attention to sexual assault and sexual harassment, all of these things, if they're causing some kind of discomfort, that discomfort can get directed onto a particular object. And so I think what has happened is conservatives have been really pretty brilliant in identifying an object who, they're children, so they are already minoritized, literally. They don't have a political voice. And I think it's also really effective that most people don't actually know a lot about transness or about what gender affirming care entails. And so it's very easy then to spread disinformation. And so I think trans kids have become this kind of symbolic flashpoint for all of these various kinds of conservative grievances. And so then they get deployed as an affective weapon, as a kind of object, rather than as a group of subjects. And of course, this depends on the paternalistic rhetoric of care that you were referencing earlier, where we can feel ourselves to be taking care of a group of people who need to be cared for. And not only does that sort of put the carer in the position of power, but it also allows them to have a sense of, a positive sense of themselves and what they're doing, right? So that they don't have to understand themselves as doing damage. They're doing something that is for the good of the one being cared for.
Right. There's a formulation you have where it's where you say conservatives care so much about trans kids that they're making it difficult for anyone who cares for a trans kid to sort of actually give them the care they need.
Right. Yeah.
No. Yeah. This affective weapon seems to be a common theme running through many of the pieces.
Mhm.
I was also going to mention, I like, Erin, how you talked about the idea that there's a necessary constitution of trans kids as objects, and that's facilitated by their necessary minoritarian status and other things as well. And that these sort of strategic and rhetorical shifts in so many ways are actually quite smart. They're quite effective, right? I think that's interesting too, because what we're seeing, right, is that there's in so many ways an underdetermination, right? So more people are slid off the register of being subject to power, but having the status of a subject. And they're necessarily becoming objects. So we could say this about migrants, we could say this about trans youth. And there's a host of other groups of people, and also ones that are sort of situational, like in situ, that get constituted as objects of repression and stuff like that. That underdetermination and the sort of like non-subject status of certain groups of people in this context, right? In so many ways, all of you discuss this through different lenses. You identify ways that this works. And what's interesting to me is what you're illustrating about the context we're in now is how narrowed and sort of phantasmatic the constituent and substantial aspects of the process of social reproduction has become. It's for only a really small group of people, right? Under Trump's second administration. So Megan, citing Kara Daggett, you note that the paternalistic construct of MAGA as, quote, an homage to mid-20th century fantasy of American life, when white men ruled their households and contested, a formula that relied upon widespread full-time employment for white men with wages that could support housewives and children, right? You get this construct that is impossibly out of time in this present, but also connected to an economic model where social reproduction is sufficient because it's reduced to a single wage earner in a household at a time where wages are kept in pace with inflation. Inequality was narrowed, at least economically. Labor was regulated to 40 hours a week. And then if you wanted to work extra, it's overtime and time and a half. We've lost the 40-hour work week long ago. Automobility was widespread, but homes were basically one-car homes, et cetera, and that was sufficient. And then, Erin, you painted an effective, complex picture of how a paternalistic rhetoric of care wielded by legislators and authorities and also popularized under the banner of parents' rights requires really strategically setting up an opponent to all of that. And that becomes the state as a whole. So you get the opponent to parents' rights and the power and influence and interests of the carer against an orbit of imagined powerful opponents. So ideologies, institutions, including academia, public schools, science, and medicine, a strategy of propping up these institutions in a particular way that they have an integral relation to the state so they can be summarily attacked, right? The idea of like setting up a prop and shooting it down. And then Isra, at the end of your article, you make a concluding claim that Trump's, quote, Trump's economic and military policies have demonstrated a fundamental weakness of hard power that is likely to result in diminishing support over time. And this in some ways kind of frames that sort of weakness, that underdetermination, the kind of thinness of what's going on. Hard power that is effective out there becomes increasingly ineffective out there. Increasingly ineffective is becoming increasingly unpopular in here within the sort of territory of the United States. It also washes away at the same time, as you describe feminist militarism, to the extent that as a project, the sort of old neoliberal alignment of multiculturalism, neoliberal policies, their interdependencies as pathways into social roles becomes contingently or circumstantially, problematic politically. It also becomes a problem because there's a loss of the neoliberal settlement entirely. So it seems like through the special issue, all of you demonstrated a fundamental inviability of this project over time through multiple different lenses, but also the inviability of the continuation of the neoliberal settlement, right? So I was wondering if any of you wanted to speak to that, right? Like, there's this really substantial and pointed analysis of what's going on. And there's sort of the question of, but what happens next? And, we're having this discussion the morning after a quote unquote, as the New York Times put it, democratic sweep, which is both indicative of everything and nothing at all, right? So it's like, where are we now after, this successful analysis? Do you want to sort of talk about what's going?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was thinking also as I was listening to Erin, I was listening to Sean's initial question about this paternal kind of politics of care. I recognize that immediately in the context of American foreign policy and the justification for long-term occupations, which include having deployed military checkpoints that we always kind of articulate in the context of these places require our security, our stabilization, our care. We're going to teach them about women's rights. We're going to teach them about gay rights. We're going to teach them about democracy. And that project, interestingly, when it's out there, works really well with something like feminist militarism, right? The idea that militarism can be something that works for feminist kind of values. And so in that way, the neoliberal kind of sentiment appears to have actually succeeded, right? Wow, look at this. We have war and progressive values coming together in this wonderfully symbiotic way. But as the cynicism about those projects sort of rises, and the domestic kind of populism is pushing back against both long-term militarism and long-term economic downturn, and they're connecting the two, right? A lot of the anti-Obama kind of independent voters went for Trump because of cynicism about Afghanistan and Iraq and the lack of kind of focus on the domestic in favor of, say, the invasion of Libya, which also is the propagation of the whole Benghazi thing. Then you have the Trump administration, who campaigns as an anti-war administration, right? He's saying, I'm going to end the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and I'm going to come home. And what's interesting is that he has reimagined the politics of care in this patriarchal way, directed towards blue cities, right? And blue states, where he says, you people can't govern yourselves. You've let things go crazy. Joe Biden, right, couldn't take care of things, old, doddering, auto pen, right? This is why the auto pen is a constant thing. So we're going to come in and use hard power here. We're going to bring in the military. We're going to have checkpoints. We're going to do raids. You know, in Afghanistan and Iraq, this is what the military would do, is break into people's homes, drag people out, no question of their, ID or whoever. You take them away, and then you figure out later if they're actually a problem. When those politics are deployed domestically, there's a complete backlash against it, right? And suddenly, feminist militarism can't be part of that project. So interestingly, there's a kind of moment here we saw, I think, in the election results last night, where people like Abigail Spanberger and Mikey Sherrill are trying to reinvigorate a domestic feminist militarism that is in opposition to the hard power that works out there. Right? We like the idea that you're bombing Iran. We like the idea that you're invading these countries. And what's interesting is that it's also creating an interesting backlash against the Trump foreign policy. People don't, he's saying we're going to invade Venezuela because these people can't take care of themselves. We're going to invade Nigeria because they're not policing correctly. We're going to go into South Africa and rescue white people from whatever is happening. We're going to open up immigration only for Germans who can't espouse hateful right-wing rhetoric, right? The idea, so they've taken this paternalist politics of care and made it into a kind of monster that has become the opposite, the reflection of the apparent success of neoliberalism when it was out there, right? When we were successfully rehabilitating Muslim states. That has become a super failure, right? The Taliban's fully back in power. Afghan women are worse off than they were before. Iraqi people are in no better situation. Libya is a disaster. And now those politics in the context of the US are not only creating this, it's not even a rejection of patriarchy, I think, because Abigail Spanberger worked for the CIA and, Mikey Sherrill is a naval pilot. It's actually an attempt, I think, to reclaim neoliberalism and patriarchy back into something that we recognize as a feminist and progressive project. But it's not working, in part because people are seeing that this militarization doesn't work in their neighborhoods. They don't want checkpoints in their neighborhoods. They don't want soldiers patrolling in their neighborhoods, even if you tell them it's for their own good. And also they are seeing that it doesn't work economically, right? That all this money that's going towards foreign wars and now ICE's domestic budget has blown up, right? The Pentagon budget is huge. The NYPD budget is huge, right? So New Yorkers in New York City are thinking about the larger context of out there militarism, in part because the other candidates really made 9/11 very central to their kind of anti-Mamdani rhetoric, which was wild to me, right? I was like, why is the Fix the City PAC like airing commercials about the Twin Towers in the last days of the election? They're trying to reinvigorate that I want to say almost excitement that came with war on terror militarism about the neoliberal project. But when you have people dealing with economic hardship and the fact they can't pay their rent, it just doesn't land, right? It's not working. And so what we see, I think, now is how these cultural issues often and politics of care are actually often economic issues and really a conversation about rising socialist kind of sentiment in the United States being more and more acceptable. And also fundamentally a kind of like a way, what does feminism look like going forward, right? And what does what does anti-racist rhetoric look like going forward, right? What is the progressive project kind of looking like going forward? And I don't think that the hard power, Pete Hegseth version of militarism is going to be the thing that helps to buoy that project, right? And it's actually going to be organized around rejecting that. So the future of hard power is really in question.
Yeah, I wondered. I know you're near New York.
Very close.
So
Yeah.
very close. And you said you work in New York, so
Yeah.
you've been feeling the election all day long, every day for the past few weeks. And I can hear that the tensions that you explore between the soft power and the hard power, the in here versus the out there. Um, but one of the key frames you explore in that piece is the fear of Muslims, the fear of Islam, and how that kind of intersects with this idea of feminist militarism. But I did wonder if you had any thoughts on the election of Zoran Mamdani yesterday, despite this sort of racist campaign against him. All that 9/11 stuff was just, it was baffling.
Yeah.
But I was impressed by his acceptance speech. He loudly proclaims himself to be an immigrant, which is a radical. It's not a radical claim to make, but it did feel really stark at this moment. This sort of rhetorical transgression, breaching that boundary between the in here and the out here, out there. You discussed. So I just wondered if you had a feeling about that.
Yeah, 100. I mean, I think what I was really surprised and heartened by is that he said, I'm an immigrant, I'm a Muslim, and I'm a socialist, and I'm unapologetic about all three, right? And those three things together mean a lot more than even them individually, right? And what's fascinating is all the rhetoric about him being an Islamist, leftist, jihadist, Marxist. He actually is embracing that in some degree by rejecting the very extreme nature of it and saying, actually, I'm not going to pretend to be someone I'm not. I'm not going to reject my Islamness or my immigrationness or my Indianness or any of that. I'm going to embrace it, even down to the aesthetics in his campaign, right? The use of Bollywood. He came out to, when he was announced as mayor, he came out to a very popular Bollywood song called Dhoom Machala, right? Which is a very significant song. And that in and of itself was an open rebuke to all of the attempt to minoritize him. But what's fascinating is that he's doing something that is a kind of, let's say, progressive version of trolling, which is where his age comes in, right? What he's doing is trolling the Cuomo Democratic kind of elite who would try to use, right, these kind of 9/11. He's laughing. He's saying, I'm 34 years old, all right? I grew up in New York City around people my age. This doesn't work with people my age. They find this ridiculous, right? And people who've lived in New York for decades also find this ridiculous. It's not going to work. So he's doing a very kind and progressive version of a gentle troll where he's saying, I am all of these things and I refuse to apologize. And you can attempt to minoritize me or you can attempt to subvert me. But in fact, I'm going to insist that you accept me. And what you are seeing now is Kathy Hochul is riding the subway, talking about how she's going to expand subway lines and the cost of living. We're seeing people talking about how taxation, 2% taxation is not that big of a deal. There's this kind of interesting way in which he's utilizing his personality to speak back to conservative and Democrat kind of standard politics in a way that I don't think the DNC even fully really understands yet, right? And is coming to terms with. But that is a very interesting way to see how war on terror militarism as a political kind of let's say, tennis ball or an entity as an object of its own object has also, it's changing. It's such a difficult thing to place in one way and assume that people will react in the way that you expect them to.
Yeah, the overlap between those different affective weapons. Saying I'm an immigrant, I'm a socialist, I'm a what was the third? And I'm a
Yes,
Marxist.
yeah,
Or
yeah.
no, what was it?
Muslim,
Immigrant,
yes.
Muslim, and a Muslim. I mean, because these things often get kind of overlaid. They kind of mean the same thing. The
Yeah,
connotations overlap in the rhetoric. Anyway, the only thing that he's missing there is that if he could say that he was also trans, right?
yes.
That would be the sort of the last piece. And that kind of reminds me of Erin, in your piece, you opened by noting the sort of overwhelming amount of anti-trans advertising in the run-up to the 2024 election. But in yesterday's election, it seemed that every politician who ran on that anti-trans platform was roundly defeated. So in Virginia, the governor's race, the Democrat Abigail Spanberger, who Yes, she's a CIA agent, but she ran on an explicitly anti-trans or trans-positive campaign, while 57% of her opponents' ads were anti-trans. So she ended up winning by 13 points. The trans journalist Erin declared yesterday a quote stunning rebuke of anti-trans politics. So what do you think about that assessment and the status of this affective weapon at the moment?
Yeah. So I mean, I think I find it incredibly heartening. It was really a relief to learn, if nothing else, that anti-trans rhetoric has failed to be as persuasive as it might have been. Um, I I want to feel really great about it. I am a little bit hesitant to be too optimistic because I think that there are a lot of things for people to be dissatisfied about right now regarding Republican leadership. And
Mhm.
so I think this election yesterday speaks to a lot of dissatisfaction about a lot of different things, including, really basic material concerns like the cost of groceries, concerns about healthcare, concerns about SNAP. And so I don't know that we can necessarily, I think that people can want those things to change and want that a lot, and also maybe harbor some anti-trans sentiment that
Sure.
is maybe less of a motivating factor for their vote. So I don't know that, we've seen any kind of overturning of the anti-trans rhetoric. And the other reason that I'm a little bit I want to be a little bit measured in my, excitement about the outcome of the election is that one of the things I tried to get at in my article is that this isn't just about, I end it by saying it was never about trans kids, right? I think
Mhm.
that one of the things that no matter how the kind of public reception of anti-trans rhetoric, however that moves, I do think that one of the things we've been seeing happening is a real erosion of democratic deliberation. And one of the ways this happens specifically through anti-trans rhetoric is the devaluing of technical knowledge. So the devaluing of medical expertise, the
Sure.
devaluing of people with expertise in education, in childhood development, all of those folks have all been very clear about their stance on, say, gender affirming care for trans youth. This is a completely uncontroversial form of care for trans youth. It is widely accepted. It has been for well over a decade now among all the major medical associations in the US. But the way that this discourse has developed has meant that that does not matter, right? That kind of expertise has been completely dismissed. And so I really think about when I, teach my undergrads about rhetoric and we learn about the spheres of argument. And so what we're seeing is a devaluation of the technical sphere of argument and the way that that gets deployed in public deliberation. And so I'm really concerned about that because if we can't rely on experts in their fields, and if we can't, take that knowledge and use it to make informed decisions about public policy, then we're left in this space where kind of just any opinion carries equal weight, right? And I don't think that there's a productive way forward for, true democratic discussion, if we can't recognize certain kinds of expertise in those discussions. So again, my worry here is that
Mhm.
that even if we can work against some of the explicitly anti-trans rhetoric, if we kind of hollow out this ability to carry out democratic deliberation more generally, then I'm not sure where that leaves us. Or I guess what I'm saying is I do have a hunch about where that leaves us, and it looks
Not
like
a good place.
authoritarianism.
Not a good place. Well, and it seems like there's a lot of implications across the American society with not having good jobs numbers or not having good information from the National Institutes of Health. I mean, this, pointing to the lack of expertise or the criticizing or devaluing of expertise is certainly essential to this entire regime.
Yeah.
So, um, well, so I know that I'm sure that there's other ways to kind of tie in the question about the neoliberal fracture that I think Rob is talking about. So I don't know if there's other sort of final points on that, but I do want to make sure that Megan can also point us to the place where most of these pieces are going to end up as a sort of I guess there's an anti-authoritarian resource that we're developing
I
Yeah.
just
or that
wanted
you're
to,
developing.
before,
Go
could I
ahead.
say something really quickly? I'm so sorry.
No, you're fine.
Really,
I had something to add to that conversation too.
oh,
before
cool.
we
Okay. All right. Do you want to go first? Do you?
Sure. I was actually going to circle back to your question in relation to some of the things that Erin was just saying. I mean, I think it's absolutely right to see a sort of link or thread between all of these pieces as kind of circulating that kind of the disruption of the neoliberal settlement, which in part was a project of privatizing risk and displacing care onto the family, and how that is obviously completely unsustainable and untenable and unbearable at this point. But its affectivity and its moral and political grammar still govern us in a lot of ways, right? And part of what I think we see is that Trumpism feeds off that contradiction. And in part, it does that by enrolling these sort of desires and attachments to this lost mythic ideal in the production of moral panics, which is what Erin focuses on in her piece. But her notion that trans kids function as objects makes me think about how there's this sort of rich history of work on sex panics in particular and moral panics more broadly that are often treated through the framework of the culture wars. And I think that some of the distinguishing features we see with the sex panics that are unfolding today, like around trans kids, is that they're being framed less as a matter of moral and cultural definition, and instead like an existential crisis. And I talk about this in my piece in terms of the global circulation of the so-called gender critical movement that scholars like Greta LaFleur and Serena Bassi have alerted us to and talk about in terms of an emergent fascist international. But what I want to say is that this sort of existential framing, right, that this is like a threat to us as a species, right, is crucial to not only how Trump but authoritarian leaders all over are leveraging to justify some rather exceptional and cruel executive actions toward queer and trans individuals especially, but also toward scholars and scientists and research institutions who study and research the realities of sexual difference. And so I think to what extent that existential framing holds up to our lived experience with our trans neighbors and our trans kids and all these this sort of interactions that we have with these people will matter, right? How does that as an existential threat hold up to the fact that you can't afford your food for the week, right? And so I think the more we kind of see people turning away from that framing is the sort of recognition that it's not the existential threat that this administration is sort of framing it as. And that's what I wanted to add on that.
Fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, the little piece I just wanted to note was that one of the things that's interesting about that sort of cumulative effect or the feeding on effect that you described, Megan, is, we all know the humanities has been in crisis probably since we've been undergraduates, right? But one of the things that's really fascinating to me right now, as we're seeing these sorts of cuts, is that if, for example, and this is really speculative, if I'm an administrator and the legitimation is around gender ideology, and then this goes directly to Erin's comment, and if there's the idea of if there's the sort of strategic and pointed attempt to remove expertise from its relationship to deliberative discourse. If I'm looking at, we often say humanities, but it's organized into liberal arts or arts and science colleges. If I'm looking, and what I'm redlining are suspected gender ideology, then I'm cutting, a cognitive linguist or a neuroscientist who's getting grants to study things like gender. I'm cutting clinical workers because of that association. So it's in so many ways a kind of deeper legitimation to move from, what is, humanistic, non-reproductive, in terms of like occupations and occupational strata, right, majors, purportedly, supposedly, we know that's also not true, but I'm now moving into expertise because of how disciplines are organized into colleges. And so there is that like cumulative effect, which is really quite disturbing, and in so many ways does link the neoliberal project in a sort of concrete way to whatever is going on right now,
which would make an authoritarian resource, anti-authoritarian resource outside of the university that much more important. So maybe
I just wanted to plug this.
Closing
so
up, yeah.
The forum is now deposited in what is an anti-authoritarian resource library that is available on the National Communication Association website. The folks who put it together, a collective of scholars and teachers and students and artists and designers, trying to sort of be brave and connect academic communities with the resources that they need to understand and confront what we're dealing with, has become an entire resource network. So we're going to be sharing resources and hosting events and creating spaces for teaching and public scholarship, film screenings, various other kinds of support network elements. And the idea is to link people who care about academic freedom and critical inquiry and solidarity, and to make all of this work accessible beyond the university. So I will be sure to share a link so that folks can reach out if they're interested in collaborating or utilizing those resources.
Thanks. When we'll make sure to put that in the link to in the show notes, along with links to all of your pieces, which this was a very generative and enriching, but also quite short conversation to discuss all of the really important insights that you develop in your individual pieces. So I encourage everyone who listens to go and check them out. But thank you all for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for
Thank you.
us.
And next Wednesday, November 12th, we're going to be meeting slightly earlier at 10 a.m. Chicago time. We'll be discussing the topic of artificial intelligence in education. We'll be joined by Brian Alexander of Georgetown University, who's a scholar and consultant who maintains a long-running research project, a Substack, and a YouTube channel on the topic of AI in education. And we'll also be joined by Marcus Breen of Boston University, who presented an excellent overview of the current culture and political economy of artificial intelligence at the last Cultural Studies Association conference. And speaking of that conference, the CFP we discussed last week is now live and accepting submission. So I'll post a link to that in the show notes as well. For next week's show, if you registered with Zoom, the same link should work. And if you're joining us on YouTube, it'll be streaming there again. But again, in both cases, we'll begin 1 hour earlier. This episode will also be available on the Breaking Culture Live YouTube channel, so please share it with your colleagues and let us know if you have ideas for future episodes or invitees by emailing us at breakingculturelive@gmail.com.
Thanks again for joining us. I'm Rob Carley.
And I'm Sean Johnson Andrews. Please check out my Substack at breakingculture.substack.com. So until next time.